All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Brendan. I'm going to be talking to you today about a workflow that I've been developing here at Liverpool, but also in collaboration with some colleagues at the University of Edinburgh. How do I go? Down. Okay. And so this is called the Particles to Planets workflow. It's Greg's name. But it's basically the idea is to understand planetary scale processes using these simulations of very tiny magnetic particles not to scale, represented here. And it does that with a sort of intermediate step where you build up models of whole rock samples from lots and lots of simulations of these tiny particles. And so the question that you might immediately ask is, why would you use magnetic particles to do this? So my answer to that is that magnets, tiny magnetic particles, are everywhere. So you may know a few sort of applications of paleomag as something that explores long-term field behavior to understand things like plate tectonics. And you might also have an idea that it's used to do stratigraphy in sediments. But there's a lot more applications. Magnetic particles are in life. There are little magnetic bacteria that orient themselves in the water column using chains of magnetic particles. And these things are very interesting because they're some of the earliest life on Earth. And so there's, some questions about, why that would have been an important thing early on. There's questions about planetary habitability and the need for a magnetic field. They're also found in your brain quite commonly. And that usually comes from pollution from cars, particularly car brake pads. And they're not very good for you if they're found in your brain. So there's a public health question about this. Frequently, we use the magnetism of pottery to date it. And actually, I'm working on a project at the moment using some of the work that I'll show you today to detect archaeological forgeries of the things that people have forged and claim are old and are trying to sell. And just as we can do this stuff on Earth, we can do this stuff on other planets. So I'm working currently on a project that's looking at some magnetic particles that were formed on impacts on the moon to see if those things can explain magnetic anomalies on the moon. There are economic applications. So there are people who are sort of working on critical minerals exploration and, things like aeromagnetic surveying. Rita last week gave a talk that mentioned that there's a lot of magnetite being formed during serpentinization, during the formation of hydrogen. So this is an important thing for that. And then finally, there's some economic applications that are outside of the natural world. So hard drives, magnetic recording media all use these tiny magnetic particles. And actually, there's a lot of work going on at the moment in medical treatment that basically looks at using heating to help with people who have tumors and things like that, using small magnetic particles to provide localized heating. So there's a lot of interesting applications of magnetic particles, and a good reason for studying them. But I think sort of to highlight the need for this, I'm going to pick out a particular application, which is an experiment that we frequently do in the lab here at Liverpool, which is known as a paleointensity experiment. So what is a paleointensity? Paleointensity is an estimate of Earth's magnetic field strength as is recorded in igneous rocks. And basically, when one of these rocks cools down, it obtains a magnetization that is, to first order, proportional to the field that it cools down in. So if you have a strong geomagnetic field at the time that that rock cools down, you get a strong internal magnetization. If you have a weak geomagnetic field, you have a weak internal magnetization. So why is this useful? What sort of, why would we care about this? Why would we want to know what the magnetic field was doing in the past? Well, this is kind of a window into the core. So Earth's magnetic field is generated in the core by the movement of iron. And so long-term trends in the strength of that field represent evolution of that core in some way. And so paleointensity data, really, if you want to study the core in the past, you're pretty out of luck, right? If you can't do this, because you don't get bits of the core thrown up at the surface too often. as you might do with, mantle xenoliths and stuff like that. You can use seismology to study it today, but, once you go back in time, this becomes really, really hard. So magnetic data are really important for this. So I just want to highlight a study that's kind of says something potentially about the core. This is a study from a group at the University of Rochester. And what they've plotted here, and the sort of top part of the plot, is a load of estimates of the ancient magnetic field strength, or paleointensity, through time, so 800 to 500 MA over a long time period. And what they've shown is that at this time period, and a lot of other people's work has kind of demonstrated this, but that at this time period, there's this large number of very low paleointensity estimates. So for relevance on this scale, today's field at a value of about 8. So we're looking at things that are sort of an order of magnitude weaker fields than today. And then from these estimates that they've made from these single crystals of plagioclase, they suddenly see that the field shoots right up at about 565 million years ago. And the sort of suggestion in this and other papers is that there is a nucleation of Earth's inner core at this time period. Basically, what happens is that Earth is cooling down. So the amount of energy in the core decreases and decreases and decreases. And then potentially, as Dan Talner in our group has said, is, that basically the core dynamo may have even died out here. And then suddenly you get a rapid increase after inner core nucleation. And the other thing that they talk about in this paper is they say, hey, look, these big changes in Earth's magnetic field strength also occur around these radiations of early multicellular animal life. So, things like the Cambrian explosion happen. And why would there be a causal link here? Well, Earth's magnetic field protects the Earth's atmosphere from space weather. Right? I don't know if you saw the northern lights the last couple of nights. It was very cloudy. I tried to look for them. I couldn't see them. But that is an interaction of the solar wind with Earth's atmosphere. And so without a magnetic field, the idea is that you get sort of progressive magnetic stripping of certain elements from the atmosphere, and that changes the chemistry of the atmosphere and oceans. That therefore has an effect on life. But these are very, very bold claims, and they're made by, a small number of data points. So we really want to be sure that these data points are good quality data, right? So how do you go about the process of obtaining one of these things? Okay, so this is a place that I went with Andy and Janine a couple of years ago to collect some samples from a dike here that is intruded into this gneiss here. And what you do in Paleomag is you drill your samples, you take a core, there you go, that's the contact in the core. And then you do your paleointensity experiment. So how does that work? Well, okay, so you know that the magnetization of the rock is proportional to the strength of the field that it was magnetized in. So the way to do this is to compare your natural magnetization to a magnetization that you've acquired in your lab. So how you do this is you start with a sample with a magnetization here that's plotted at sort of 1 on this axis, and then you heat and cool your sample in a 0 field, and what that does is it partially demagnetizes the sample, and we're going to plot the magnetization remaining on this y-axis here. Then what we do is we heat and cool in a lab field to partially remagnetize the sample, and we have the magnetization gained in that step here. And then we plot that at a load of different temperatures, and the slope of the line on this plot is equal to the ratio of the ancient field to the lab field. So from that, because you know what your lab field was, you can back out. And if you want to get anything from this, this should be a straight line, is the idea. So what happens if you do this in practice in an experiment? Well, sometimes these are real data. Sometimes you get a great straight line. Very, very rarely. This is like about one of the nicest experiments that I've ever shown. At other times, you get something like this. Does anyone want to offer up an interpretation of this? Because I certainly don't. But probably most commonly what we see is we see a pattern that looks something like this, which is this sort of curved behavior. And actually, if you analyze this, you could say, oh, maybe there's a linear part here and a linear trend here that we could fit. Maybe, you know, something went wrong at the high temperatures or something went wrong at the low temperatures, sure. You know, but if you fit either of these two lines, this actually gives you a really, really inaccurate result. And we don't really understand why this happens physically, right? People have sort of come up with phenomenological models that can reproduce this kind of behavior, but there's no physical understanding of this behavior. And this is really bad, because it means when you analyze your data, you just kind of have to come up with a statistic that tells you, okay, it should be less curved than this. And you can empirically test that. You can empirically test the accuracy of that. But you end up with, what happens is you end up with a lot of different statistics. So Greg spent a while, I think he has a 2014 paper listing these, and it lists over 40 different of these selection criteria that people use to accept or reject their data from this experiment. And depending on what lab you're in and what study you're in, there will be a slightly different set, so it makes it hard to compare data. And the big problem is kind of whatever you're using. I find that typically people will get sort of failure rates of something like 75 to 90%. So, this is a very painstaking process. Each one of these points involves 2 heatings, which means multiple kind of hour-long cyclings in an oven and then measurement. And you end up rejecting 75% of your data. So this isn't great, right? And this causes problems when it comes to analyzing data. So if I look at that data set that I showed earlier, these are a load of results by Simon from our lab, where he's collected new data. And this is that trend line that I was showing before. And the blue results are data that have been corrected from that trend line. This had no samples that passed Simon's criteria. And you can see that this reanalysis really doesn't show much evidence for this sudden increase where you've suddenly now moved to this new regime in the core, because you go right back down again. And this data point's kind of an outlier. You can see that this data point's almost exactly the same age and is significantly lower. So why are we getting this such inconsistent behavior? Is it just that there's different analysis methods? Why are the failure rates so hard? What's the issue? Is it because we looked at whole rocks and they looked at single crystals? Is there something different about those different materials? What's going on? And to dig into this, we really need to understand how rocks record a magnetization. So for that, you have to understand magnetic particles. Rocks have lots of tiny particles of iron titanium oxides. This is a load of them in an SEM image in that dike that I showed you before. So all the white things, or the light-colored things here in this backscattered electron image, are the iron titanium oxides. And we really need a theory that can explain how these oxides behave in our experiments on these whole rocks. Right, so we need to be able to go from these particles to these whole rocks. So what's our understanding of magnetic particles? What's sort of the classical view? A sort of initial idea is that, okay, so maybe you have some particles that are magnetized in a certain direction, right? They have a magnetization, they're uniformly magnetized, and we have an idea about how these things behave, and we think they're good magnetic recorders. But this only applies to small particles. It was very quickly discovered in the early 20th century because we can look at these things because they're large by observational data, that actually most magnetic materials in large particles, larger than about a micron, form what are known as multi-domain behavior. So they have these multiple regions of uniform magnetization that are separated by these very, very narrow regions where things change. And these multi-domain samples, these multi-domain particles, are not good magnetic recorders. We know this, and we think that they're probably also not what's recording the majority of the remnants in our rocks. And the reason for that is that the domains, first of all, the domains tend to cancel one another out. You can see here that, you've got everything in this direction and everything in this direction, so the net's about 0. And so therefore, these things are probably not the things that are recording the magnetization in our rocks. Also, they tend to be very, very unstable to the extent that they're just recording the present day field. They're not recording ancient fields, they're recording modern fields if they're recording a field at all. But in between these two regimes, people started to notice this behavior that was kind of like single domain behavior, but wasn't. And no one really knows how these things are magnetized. And what's worse, most of the remnants in rocks, it turns out, is probably carried by these things. When people started digging into this, they found that, the majority of the time when you sort of did an analysis like this, you ended up finding out that the majority of your magnetization of your rock is this. whatever this is. But okay, we don't have any sort of a theory that can describe this because we don't know what this is. So people kind of ignored it and said, okay, let's just focus on the smallest particles that are good magnetic recorders, and let's come up with a theory for those. So this was done in 1949. And nearly all paleomagnetic experiments are based on this theory of magnetic particles that was developed by a French physicist called Louis Néel. Here he is here in 1970, winning a Nobel Prize for this work. And this is a really, really powerful theory because it explains how rocks can retain their records of magnetic fields over millions to billions of years. And it also can predict the experimental behavior, at short time scales as well. It's this very flexible model that can do it. So what is this model? I'm now going to show you some equations. Don't be scared. They're really not that bad, honestly. So the idea behind this theory is if you have a magnetic particle that looks like this, it wants to be magnetized uniformly in one of two directions along its long axis. And for it to switch between those two directions to go from A to B, it needs to overcome some energy barrier where it has to be magnetized along some direction that it really doesn't want to be, that's energetically unfavorable. That energy barrier is represented here. Now, what will happen at temperature, if you have sort of a thermal energy, is that thermal energy will disturb this and allow you to switch from A to B in some way. It can overcome that barrier. And this formula that they came up with, which is known as the relaxation time formula, is basically it's the amount of time for your particle to go from A to B on average is governed by this exponential of the energy barrier over the thermal energy, right? So what that says is that at high temperature, you're going to be able to switch really, really easily, and this thing is not going to record a consistent magnetization. It's just going to equilibrate with whatever field it's in. When you go to low temperature, it becomes locked in, or what's known as blocked, and then your magnetization is able to stick around for millions to billions of years. There's also this additional term in here, and what this says is that if you're moving to a direction that's more aligned with the field, that's lower energy, so the average time to switch to that is less, so you're statistically more likely to be aligned with the field, right? That's all that's saying. So it provides a little bit of a bias. This second equation that I'm showing you is about the probability of this particle being in state A or B. And the reason that I have this up here is this is the equation that governs how basically how a large number of these particles will behave in a rock, right? So if you have, a large probability of being in A, that means that you're in a stronger field, because what this is telling you is that will change in time in a way such that this coefficient is going to be really small. So you're going to increase your probability of being in A. This coefficient is going to be really large, so you're going to decrease. Whereas if these are both the same, as in this term 0, you have no field. Effectively, what's going to happen is that these terms are going to be the same. There's going to be no change. And so the equilibrium value will be to have a 50-50 chance of being in either direction, i.e. zero net magnetization, right? So this is the theory that governs basically all of paleomag. That might be a bit complicated, but here's what you need to know. Although we're basing everything off of this, we've got some pretty stringent assumptions here, right? We've said that it has to be uniformly magnetized, and it turns out that that means that you must be smaller than 100 nanometers for a particle to behave in this way. You need 2 minimum energy states, and that basically implies that you have some sort of elongation in your particle, right? And that may not always be the case, right? It needs to be ellipsoidal for this theory to work, so it needs to be an ellipsoid. That's a restriction. And most people, when they apply this, they use magnetite. So everyone assumes that everything is magnetite, right? Are these assumptions valid for most rocks? Well, no. Here's a fib slice and view image of some particles in a basalt rock. So these are iron oxides that are holding the magnetization in a basalt rock. These scales are in microns. You can see that, first of all, lots of things are bigger than 100 nanometers. They're not all elongate ellipsoids, right? There's quite a variety of shapes in here, from oblate to prolate to sort of roughly almost spherical. And then if we actually look at the composition, that titanium composition in your oxides, you can actually see that not everything is magnetite. About maybe a quarter of rocks are containing sort of pure stoichiometric magnetite, but a lot of things contain titanomagnetite. So this is some data that I've collected from magnetics data, or Greg collected, and I put in this 2024 paper. So we need a theory that can explain, how shape and how this composition affects the behavior of these particles. So how do we do that? Okay, we need to cross out these assumptions, right? We need to say, okay, don't have two minimum energy states, don't just have an elongate particle, and don't just have magnetite mineralogy. So what happens if you do that? Well, we need to calculate what the energy is, right, to get from one of these states to another state. How are we going to do that? Well, if it's uniformly magnetized and ellipsoidal, we still have a way of doing this. What we can do is we can plot up a surface of the energy. And those elongate particles, that surface looks like this. So the darker colors are lower energy, the lighter colors are higher energy. And you can see that, yeah, you go from here to here, these are the minimum energy states, and the barrier is somewhere here, right? That's the maximum that you have to go through. If you have a particle that's got no kind of shape difference, it's just a sphere, what ends up happening is that your minimum energy is controlled by the cubic crystal structure of the particle, right? So these magnetite and titanomagnetites are in the cubic system. That has an energy that basically wants to be magnetized along the corners of a cube. And so you end up with 8 different states. Okay. So you can do this, you can generalize this theory. And then in terms of our equations that we saw before, they actually stay pretty much the same, except that now instead of this one differential equation that we had previously, we now have a whole range of them, one for each different state. And this is why in the 1940s, Louis Néel didn't do this, is because you basically had to calculate a load of simultaneous differential equations, which is quite difficult to do by hand, but we have computers now, and it's possible to do this. So what I've spent probably the majority of my postdoc developing is this tool known as the SDCC. And what this does is it takes all that theory and it simulates bulk experiments from those first principles, not just in magnetite that's elongate, but in different shapes and sizes of particles and in different compositions. And you can mix and match, any mixture of particles you want can be put in here. So we can simulate, our paleointensity experiments, but also we can simulate basically any other experiment that we can do in our lab, except for one, I think, which is microwaves. But we can simulate pretty much everything. And so if we simulate these things using your sort of classical elongate magnetites, then we get all the behavior that we expect. Everything behaves well. But what if we look at things with different compositions and different shapes, those multi-axial particles, and simulate a paleointensity experiment? Do we get a straight line? No, we don't. So this is really, really interesting because for the longest time, people had said, oh, these small single domain particles are the ideal particles that record the magnetic field the best. And therefore, we should be going out and sampling rocks that have exclusively really small particles, things that are glassy, things like that. This shows that actually size is not necessarily the only thing that's important in deciding, whether something's a good magnetic recorder or not. And the things that behave badly here are things that have not multi-axial behavior, not uniaxial behavior, but actually a mixture of the two where they're fighting against one another. And that's shown here. So what's plotted up here is the axial ratio of different particles against the composition, right? So the titanomagnetite content as a percentage. So, and what you see here, the colors here represent the angle between the minimum energy magnetization direction and the long axis, right? So this angle here. So where they're yellow, that means that your minimum energy magnetization direction's along the long axis, you're uniaxial. Where they're purple, that means that you're totally multi-axial. And where they're sort of pink, that means that you're somewhere in between. You've got a mixture of both of these effects going on. And these are the things that are causing that nonlinear behavior in your paleointensity experiment. And what this shows is that if you're in magnetite, right, on this side of the plot, you go very quickly from being in that multi-axial regime to being in that uniaxial regime. So most of your particles are probably going to be okay, right? Because you just need a little bit of an elongation to make everything work. However, if you're in sort of the regime where you've got titanomagnetite 30 to 40, you're in trouble. because it means that you've got a lot of different shapes where you can have this badly behaved behavior going on. Okay, so that's interesting. We've kind of quantified how well things will behave in paleointensity experiment as a function of shape and composition. But there is an elephant in the room, which is all of this is for single domain particles, those uniformly magnetized things. And earlier on, I just told you that most of the remnants in rocks is carried by these pseudo single domain particles. What are those, right? These things that we don't know what they are. Can we get a better handle on this? Well, since the late 1980s, there has been this technique that's been developed, and a lot of this has been done by the group at Edinburgh that I've been working with, called micromagnetic modeling. And what micromagnetic modeling is instead of just assuming that everything is uniformly magnetized, you take this 3D finite element model and you find the magnetization that minimizes the energy by varying all these different vectors inside your particle, right? So this is a simulation of a particle that's a cube. And what has been found over and over again is a lot of this so-called PSD behavior is sort of inferred to be what's known as a vortex state, which is basically where you have this magnetization that's whirling around in a vortex, and then you have this uniform part in the middle that's magnetized along what's known as a vortex core. And sort of for convenience, what we do a lot of the time is we make this surface which kind of outlines where that core is to show you what the vortex is. So question you might have is okay, so we know that this happens as you increase the size, but at what sizes, right? Well, when does this happen? So one of the best studies on this has been done by our very own Louis Néel, and he found that basically he did calculated these micromagnetic models, minimum energy states of particles by minimizing the energy, making the particle bigger, minimizing the energy again, making the particle bigger, minimizing the energy again, making the particle bigger. And he finds that as you grow the particle above about 100 to 200 nanometers, you end up with this vortex state highlighted by this. So these solid colors are the single domain, these colors are the vortex state. And then once you get above a micron, you start to make this sort of multi-domain state where you've got a lot more going on. You've got these different regions separating out, highlighted by these things here. And then what he finds is that as you go back and you decrease the size, you don't actually change back to single domain at the same size. What you find is that there's a range of sizes where you can have both the single domain and the vortex state as being possible magnetization states. So this means that you have something that where you have multiple different possible magnetization states that are available to that particle. And that could be, as I said, with that sort of multi-axial versus uniaxial thing, when you've got multiple different states competing with one another, this is an idea that potentially something there will behave poorly in our paleointensity experiment. So in this region at the start of your single domain to single vortex transition. So in summary, above about 70, 80, and above you get single vortex, and then above about a micron you get multi-domain, right? That's kind of our regime that I showed you before, that classic regime. But how does this change with the shape and composition of particles, right? We did it for single domain. Can we do it for this? So in 24, I did this study of this, where basically this is the same thing, but plotted in a different way. So the yellow ones are uniformly magnetized particles, and this is the magnetization as you increase the size on this axis. And basically, at some point, it suddenly drops down as you change into this vortex state where only part of it is uniformly magnetized, right? So you have a region where you've got a vortex state, and then the orange line, as you're reducing the size and re-minimizing your magnetization, you end up with switching back to a single domain state, but again, at a lower size. And then this region defines the bounds of where you have this potentially unstable zone, where you've got both the single domain state and that vortex state in your particles that could perform badly in our experiments. So I did this over a range of shapes. You can see that you don't just get vortexes along the long axis, you get a load of weird stuff as well. So, and in this study, I saw vortexes along the short axis, vortexes that are sort of bendy slightly towards various directions. And again, there's this kind of whole menagerie of behavior, right? Which again might indicate that you've got some potential problems in your experiments going on. So okay, what do I find when I do this as a function of shape and composition? Well, just like for the single domain behavior, I find that this single domain and single vortex region, which is a proxy for this poorly behaved stuff, is wider for titanomagnetite compositions between 30 and 40%, right? Very, very similar to the behavior that we see in the single domain stuff. Additionally, there's a change with shape. So this is now the same thing. So I should show this is size, this is composition. So the single vortex is up here, the single domain, single vortex is here, and single domain here. Then this line here and this line here are now taken into 3 dimensions with the blue and red surfaces here, right? And you can see that the gap between these surfaces also increases as a function of the axial ratio. So an axial ratio of 1 is a sphere, an axial ratio of 0.5 is an oblate ellipsoid, and an axial ratio of 3 is a prolate ellipsoid. And so what we can see here is that this overlap, i.e. the region between the 2 surfaces, is larger in the prolate and oblate particles as well, right? So when you just look at this equidimensional behavior, you know, this is kind of a small effect, but as soon as you get away from magnetite and as soon as you get away from this kind of regular shape, suddenly things get a lot more complicated. But there is a limitation to this. This is just saying that there are multiple states available, right? We don't know how relatively stable those states are. It could be the case that in some of this region, you know, that single domain state is stable, but far less stable than the single vortex state. And therefore, realistically, you only have the single vortex state energetically, right? So we really need to start digging into, you know, how the energy landscape, like those surfaces that I showed you before, look for these things. And there is a way of doing this with micromagnetic modeling. You can calculate a barrier between 2 energy states, and you can calculate what's known as a blocking temperature. This is, as I mentioned before, with your Néel equation, remember that at high temperature, you're able to switch between states very, very easily, and at low temperature, they become blocked in. So the blocking temperature is the temperature at which you suddenly go from being, you know, able to switch your magnetization states over seconds to being able to switch your magnetization states over millions of years, stable over millions of years. So below this temperature, things are stable over millions of years. And again, Les and others wrote this paper in 2017, doing this for sort of an equidimensional magnetite particle. And what they find is in that region where you go from the single domain state to the single vortex state, you have this crash in the stability of your particle, right? This blocking temperature comes right down, and these things basically are not even stable at room temperature. So this is a proxy for unstable behavior, things that, you know, basically won't retain ancient magnetization magnetizations very well at all. And so then the question again for this is kind of a theme. What does this look like in particles of different shapes? What does this look like in particles of different compositions, right? And so can we use our kind of framework that we had before, our SDCC kind of framework for simulating different experiments to get a handle on this with, in a general way, as a function of shape and composition? And it turns out, yeah, the equations stay exactly the same, but now you've got these micromagnetic models, you can kick out the ellipsoidal particle constraint, and you can kick out the constraint that you have to be uniformly magnetized, because now we've got a way to solve this. Right, so same physics, same equations, but we have these micromagnetic models to solve this. So this is a plot that's very similar to the last one in those red colors. You just see that the blocking temperature increases and then decreases at a particular size. So in magnetite, that unstable region is at about 100 nanometers, as I mentioned before. In titanomagnetite 30, it happens at about 150 nanometers. And in titanomagnetite 60, it happens at about 200 nanometers. And again, this is reflective of that kind of transition between the single domain and single vortex state. Here's just another way of showing that. This is kind of, again, the blocking temperature, which you can think of as a proxy for the stability as a function of composition and of size. And you can see right the way through here, there is this band of things that are relatively unstable. So again, we want to be avoiding this if we're sampling our samples in the field. All right, so This is just the same thing as I showed you before, but now what I'm looking at is something that has a 44% elongation along one of the axes. And what you see here is that the behavior is slightly different. You have this drop off, maybe not such an extreme drop off in the blocking temperature and its stability, but then it doesn't come back up very quickly. You can see that in magnetite, you're maybe just starting to recover at this sort of maximum size, this 240 nanometer size. But what you're seeing here is that these slightly elongate particles, like I showed you before in the single domain stuff, have this wider unstable zone. And what that means is you have a much wider region where these particles are going to behave poorly in your experiments compared to just an equidimensional particle. So that's a lot of theory. What are sort of the practical implications of this, and how can we use this? So sort of as a take-home message for paleomagnetists, the important thing is we used to think that it was just size, right? We used to think that you can take stuff that is finely grained and measure it in the lab, and you should be safe as long as everything's smaller than about 100 nanometers, which is hard to find, but if you find it, you should be okay. Now what I'm saying is that actually you need to think about doing microscopy and maybe some, magnetic measurements that tell you what the composition of your particles are, because we know that slightly elongate particles are really poor magnetic recorders, and we know that the titanium composition of particles, really matters, and that you want to avoid things that are around TM 30 to 40. So what does this mean practically for certain studies, like this question of, Earth's magnetic field strength through time? Well, in these studies that are highlighted and are kind of being fit by this red trend line, what you can see here is that this point here is sort of a particular outlier compared to everything else. If you sort of followed along here, you wanted to plot a line through this, you'd kind of think, okay, there seems to be a going up and then a going down, but this sudden jump is really decided by this point. And in this paper, they identified these samples as having predominantly carriers which are titanomagnetite 30. So this could be potentially a reason why this gives a completely different result to everything else. It's because potentially these are unreliable recorders. And if you look at the data in this, there are some questions that we have, particularly about the sort of blocking temperatures that could explain why this is an outlier. So this has sort of practical uses already. But in the future, where I want to go with this, I think that really, although this is a useful tool, what would be really great is to have a framework where you can simulate any experiment you want to understand what your experimental behavior should be for your given rock. And you want a way of taking the inverse of that. You want a way of having your experimental data and using your experimental data to tell you something about the Earth with your improved theory. And so far what I've shown you is that things are a very complicated function of, different sizes, shapes, compositions. This is a really hard problem to get your head around. So how might you do this? Well, this is actually, in my opinion, a perfect opportunity for doing machine learning, right? So the idea here is that you do your microscopy to constrain what your magnetic particles are, and then using what I've just shown you, you can simulate basically any paleomagnetic experiment you want, right? Whatever you want can just be simulated through this workflow. And that allows you to produce a load of training data for a neural network, right? You know that, if your field was this much and your rock was exposed to these previous conditions and all this happened to it, you can train your neural network to on your generated data from your micromag SDCC. Then you have a trained neural network. You can validate it by putting in experimental results, real data, and seeing what set of initial conditions or what kind of, history happened to your rock that produce those experimental data in your neural network inversion, and then come up with an interpretation. So this is kind of what I'm going to leave you on. This is just the workflow for the future that I want to come up with. So far, we've kind of got this part, really, really well done. We need some microscopy to start training things. And then I think, the ability to do this inversion in the future will basically give us, the ability to really revolutionize paleomag, because currently we have all these things that look like this, that we don't understand how to interpret. We have no ability to understand how, what's going on here. And with this, we might actually be able to interpret them and actually get a signal out of this, because this is not noise, it's some behavior that we currently don't understand. Right, that's all for today. If you have any questions, yeah, go for it.
Good, nice talk. Very, very cool. So within the generalized theory that you just presented,
Yeah.
those curved experimental results.
Yes, this one.
Yeah, or even the very last one.
Yeah.
The ones that are hard to interpret because they're slightly curved.
Yeah.
So when you generalize the theory
Yeah.
to account for size, shape, and composition,
Mhm.
you know, is it still, can you just look at that curved line and come up with any simple interpretation of that? Like, why does it look curved, or is it still mysterious?
So that's so can we I guess I'm gonna re-ask the question then. So the question was, can you interpret this once you have your generalized theory?
Yeah.
Or is it still mysterious? So I guess there's sort of two questions there. One is, can we generate these using our generalized theory? And the answer is yes, we can. So we can produce things that are curved in this way that do look like this. There's a paper that Les was first author on in 2022 where he generated something like this. The second question is can we then invert it? I haven't done inversions with these yet, so that is a question of how non-unique this is. I think the big thing in this is that if you add the microscopy data in there, which are constraining what your grains are in the first place, that makes it significantly less non-unique, because you basically then all you have is what the set of initial conditions are. And there may still be a bit of non-uniqueness, but currently it's like wide open, right? It could basically be anything.
I see.
And so that's kind of where we're trying to go with this. Yeah. So this inversion part, not quite there. I'm still just at the points. If you come to here, there's still a few missing gaps in here. So this is the part that I'm currently working on at the moment, is kind of getting this workflow together to get the forward model working in every single case. But yeah, that's kind of, so the inversion's not there yet.
Yeah, good. Thanks.
Very interesting. Thanks, Brendan. I think you made a pretty convincing case that paleointensity data is quite complicated. So I wonder whether you think any of the data that's published on paleointensities is any good. Because you basically draw attention, apart from the outside of Liverpool, of course, because obviously the data coming out of Liverpool would be excellent. But you sort of draw attention to a particular case where there's a particularly dubious data point, for example, and that's quite important in understanding Earth history. So I kind of wondered how good the data is that's out there. Can we trust any of it? And are there other big events in Earth history are therefore under question?
So it's a very good question. The answer is yes, we can trust it. I mean, if you do paleointensity, on modern day samples, you are generally right? You generally get the right answer. Going back further in time, it's obviously not possible to test that against anything, so that becomes more difficult. But if I kind of go back to my initial thing, we do select out a lot, and you do sometimes get this. Like this is not impossible to get, and when you see this, you know that things are behaving according to theory, right? And it's not impossible. The issue is that you can get these extreme end member cases that I've shown here, but you can also get a whole lot of behavior in between. And so the sort of debate is, how much do we allow of this curvature before we can say that this is a problem? How much do we allow of X and Y? And everyone has a slightly different opinion on this, right? And so, well, Greg has a specific opinion on this, right? But how much do these, there's some empirical data that constrain these, but yeah, the issue is that there's kind of a whole scale of things. And so some data are better than others, but by how much, doing that direct comparison when you don't have a theory is really challenging. So I wouldn't say, yeah, all the data are bad. I'd say that a lot of the data are good, And, you know, often you find that things are quite robust no matter what analyses you do to them. But there are these inconsistencies that need to be resolved. And yeah, it's just extremely challenging to analyze.
Chasing that a bit further about you said about the recent historical stuff.
Yeah.
So we have now close to 200 years of period where we can look at lavas or archaeological artifacts or things. And people have done that. I'd say not me, but it was Néel who did all the work. And we looked at the decay of the field over time. And in particular, for the period from 1830 onwards, you do a really nice job of explaining the variation in intensity over that period. And that's a fairly small signal. We're talking about accuracies of percents or sub-percents for the periods. So it clearly is possible to do something with it.
Yeah.
So three points on that. First point is, don't be too depressed in front of a general audience. Do remind them that it actually is useful more often.
Okay.
Secondly, can you look at the insight of those modern measurements? Obviously, it's much easier than the old ones, but not to get an insight of where they go. And there's a lot of these things which would have had these problems where the data seemed to be good. And as Néel suggested, the trick was just make lots of measurements and use some robust statistics. So that suggests that maybe some of the difficulties that you're talking about, somehow, despite them, the result does come out okay. And there was a third point, but I've forgotten it, which everyone will be relieved about.
Yeah. Was there a question?
The question was, you look at modern data.
Yes.
You look at the state of things, you look at the state of the experiments.
Yeah.
And yeah, there are all these problems, but nonetheless, there's enough from them that you can do a really good job.
Yeah.
Therefore, maybe things aren't quite as bad as you think.
Oh, okay. So yes, that is an interesting question. So there's a couple of reasons why there's still some cause for concern, but I do agree with you. Yes,
there's cause for
yeah,
concern.
Yeah.
Not for wailing, gnashing of teeth.
No. I don't think. I'm saying that there's. Yeah, I'm highlighting the problem, but absolutely, there is. I should highlight that there's a really important use for this stuff. Things get much more challenging as you go further back in time because things have much more difficult histories to reconstruct and more things have happened to those rocks. There's also been some discovery of some effects that are sort of time dependent. So there's a study that I was on in 2021 where we showed that basically if you leave these things in a field for 5 years and then measure them again, do the experiment again, you find that the curvature has increased. So there's some temporal effects. So maybe it's possible that things are older. This is more of a problem for than things that are younger, but that is, again, very hard to test. So yeah, I think overall you're right that if you have large numbers of statistics, yes, you can get something good. The issue is that when you have these older samples, you tend to have more limited material. You tend to have worse statistics, you tend to fail more things. And so it gets trickier and trickier. And so having a way of succeeding, having a way of interpreting another 50% of your samples would be very, very useful.
I'm not denying that what you're saying will be very useful.
Yeah.
It just might be interested in testing the ideas against the modern samples.
Yeah, well, we will be doing some of that, right? So it's not. I'm not exclusively looking at these data to sort of try and
clearly that's the lovely payoff. But
yeah, that's sort of the motivation. But yeah, no, we're looking at some recent stuff with this as well. That's what some of the microscopy is going to be done on initially.
Brendan, so a lot of your plots sort of end at about 250 nanometers.
Yes.
Something. So what's the scope then to really, that's a long way short of anything we're seeing in the optical light, for example, which
Sure.
Can be carrying the remnants. So yeah, what's the scope then to sort of, push towards, tens of microns, which might still be stable.
Yeah, tens of microns is challenging. I think we can get to microns, okay. Right? So I think with these models, you have because of the size of these elements, you have something of a volume limit in your memory, right? When you're running these models. And so as you get up to, really, really large sizes, this becomes computationally a lot harder. But if we've able to simulate these things for stuff that's micron. I've just sort of started with this stuff that's up to a quarter micron so far.
So a follow-on question then.
Yeah.
Are you thinking that actually, if you've got this whole spread of grain sizes in your whole rock, that actually the stuff that you're seeing that tens of microns is carrying very much?
That seems to be the case. I mean, there's a paper by Franco last year that came out that seemed to suggest that the majority of remnants is being carried by particles in the sort of 100 nanometers to a micron range.
Okay, all right.
So that does seem to be the case. Yeah. Greg's got a question as well.
Thanks very much. That was a very, very clear and exciting and interesting talk for sure. I mean, you might imagine I'm interested in microscopy, and I'd like to understand a little bit more. I mean, it is on your last slide, so I got the message. It's very new, and it's something that clearly is for the future.
Yeah.
But do you have a sense of where the state of the art, for microscopy and its link with micromagnetism is at the moment, and
yes,
what has been done, and where is it going from?
Yeah, so I had a few slides on this, but I had to sort of cut them for time on the sort of different techniques that are currently being used. So there's quite a lot of interesting developments in microscopy and magnetism. So I showed some of the fib slice and view stuff because right here, right? This is kind of nice for what we're doing, because for the modeling, you can get a 3D model directly generated from you that you can then just put into your micromagnetic modeling. But on a larger scale, there's some interesting stuff going on. So here, this thing that I've plotted that you can't really see very well is a magnetic map of a sample overlaid on top of an SEM image, which is made using something known as a quantum diamond microscope. And these things basically have the ability to map in 2D. There's some X-ray techniques that have the ability to map things in 3D. The resolution is not nanometers of those things. But what's quite useful about them is you can identify regions of interest in your sample using one of these broader scale magnetic techniques that tells what your magnetization is in your sample is doing, and then go in deeper with something like fib slice and view, and then get out what grains are directly responsible for that. So there's actually some pretty powerful things that I think you can do with that. I've actually done some work where I basically measured one of these things in between steps in an experiment to see how things change, and then identified regions where things were behaving well and badly. And so then you can actually go in and say, okay, which grains are directly responsible for that bad behavior, right? And so there's some quite interesting stuff that you can do in microscopy. Does that answer your question about state of the art?
Yes, thank you. I guess
yeah,
this time permitting.
Yeah. I've clearly forgotten something because he's asking a question.
No, I mean, this is just maybe following on a little bit from Andy's question about capabilities of these models. So the micromagnetic side of things, we are now at a development stage where a micron of magnetite is completely achievable.
Yeah, completely.
Time consuming, but achievable. If we go to a variable composition, something close to a TM60, several microns is achievable.
So yeah, I should say these as you see things go further to the right to larger sizes here, actually we can simulate things at larger sizes for these compositions as well. So we can go higher. Yeah.
We're now putting together a workflow where we think in the next 2 or 3, well, let's say 3 or 4 years, we will be able to hit sort of tens of microns with some of these particles. Not necessarily at the peak resolution that we want, but I think we can start to potentially achieve stuff that's getting, let's say 10 microns, and we'll drop this part of it, but certainly we're looking at a pipeline for very big grains compared to what we've done before.
And if if you have the compute power, you can do it now, right? Like, this paper, Les ran this on Archer 2, but this goes up to 3 microns, right? So, with increasing compute power, you'll probably also be able to push that up as well. Yeah. Good.